In the sparsely inhabited Southern California desert, the cities of Palmdale and Barstow lie 66 miles apart as the crow flies. Though both are population centers and sit astride major hubs and freeways, no direct route exists between them. In 1965, a freeway, California 122, was proposed to connect the two cities, but it was never built. So if you go back through history to the earliest road maps of the area, be they of San Bernardino County, California, or the USGS topographical maps, they all agree. There is no road connecting Palmdale and Barstow, and there never was. And yet, in 2023, if you search Google Maps for Barstow Road, Palmdale, California, it will show you several disconnected segments of dirt road running along a diagonal southwest and northeast track. If you switch to the aerial photography and continue along the same line, you will find traces and, in some areas, drivable road that you can follow all the way from outside the Palmdale Airport to California Route 58, about 15 miles west of its entry into Barstow. So, whatever the maps might say, the evidence of aerial photographs and on the ground is indisputable. Someone, at some time, built a road through these 60 miles of remote desert to make a direct connection between these two cities. And there is virtually no record of who, how, or why. So today, we'll visit this dusty path and the remains of its only settlement, if you could call it that, and try to unravel the baffling history of this forgotten mystery road. With only a few deviations, the old Palmdale to Barstow Road, whatever it was, follows a nearly arrow-straight path northeast to southwest from Highway 58 just west of the town of Hinckley, to a point 9 miles east of Palmdale, where it then veers straight west following a horizontal alignment through modern-day Palmdale Airport towards the city in line with what is now Blackbird Drive and Avenue 08. Though the eastern portion of the road is in good condition and remains in use for local traffic and desert sporting events, much of the western part has vanished into the sagebrush. At our first stop, at the road's last traceable point after it turns due west into the Palmdale Airport grounds, it is nearly invisible. This is the last traceable stretch of the old road as it goes south towards Palmdale. A few hundred meters ahead of us, it turns on its diagonal path that it follows all the way through the desert to near Barstow. There's a faint trace of the road continuing westward from this point, going towards some plowed fields and the site of the Palmdale Airport. Interestingly, there is a gate at this point, which indicates there was a pass through the fence at one time, but there's very little trace from the ground of the road continuing from this point. Here you can see the straight shot of the old road going through private land owned by the Palmdale Airport as it is about to execute a half-angle turn towards Palmdale. Looks like a pole line in the distance. The sight of telephone poles along the right-of-way gives us our first possible clue about the origin of the road. Now, when I first researched this in 2012, what little information existed on the web stated that the mystery road was in fact an old stagecoach route. That would make sense, as the earliest such routes across the desert, like the Nadeau Shotgun Road we saw in episode 37, were surveyed in straight lines over long distances just like this. But there's a problem with that. The first detailed maps I can find of the route of the mystery road were on the geographical survey maps that were conducted in the area between 1930 and 1937, and there is no trace of any part of the road on any of them. The first time the mystery road shows up on a map is in 1943 on the preliminary edition of the U.S. Geological Survey map for Alpine Butte, showing the area that we're about to look at. And interestingly, a couple of later maps of this same area, including the 1957 High Vista USGS map, clearly say this is the telephone road. Indeed, public utilities were often the first to make make paths into remote areas, like the 1929 road through Angeles Crest built by Edison that we hiked in episode 38. Utility roads usually were surveyed as a straight shot wherever possible, and a telecommunications connection between Barstow and Palmdale would make all kinds of sense. So, with the discovery of old telephone poles along the right-of-way, could our mystery already be solved? Well, not so fast. Those telephone poles only run along the old right-of-way for 1.27 miles, bizarrely ending at a dirt road intersection in the middle of nowhere. Moreover, even the 1943 map already shows gaps in the path of the road despite it seemingly having been built after 1937. The earliest aerial photograph of the road from 1948 shows part of the roadbed already plowed over, and that fully plowed field is the same plot of land we're looking at poles on right now. So whatever happened later, there's no way there were telephone poles there in 1948, and apparently by 48 our supposedly brand new road was already buried under someone's alfalfa patch. On top of that, aerial photographs from 1953 and 1954 already show large parts of the western section of the road nearly vanished into the desert, and in some cases covered over by farmland. The implication is that either it is a much older road than the map evidence would suggest, or that once it was built, it immediately fell into disuse and degraded rapidly. So while these poles may have been up in 1957, causing the naming on the map, if there were telephone poles over other parts of the road, there's no obvious evidence of them now. But the maps and aerial photographs from the 50s of the area a little further ahead offer another intriguing clue about the road, and we'll get to that shortly. But first, we pick up the track near Saddleback Butte State Park, where it passes another obscure and fascinating bit of desert roadside history. Much of the area to the west of Saddleback Butte, the road disappears into the sagebrush. If you look very far in the distance, you can actually see the route of the road from here. And you can just barely make out how it would have run from here to there, with a vivid imagination, of course. So what we're actually doing here is finding the traces of what was a lost superhighway of its time. The odd thing about it being out in the middle of nowhere, where basically nothing is we also have this Ersatz cafe and gas station on a side road where there never was any major traffic. And that's because this is all a movie set. You might recognize it from the REM video Man on the Moon. Club Ed, as it's called, has been used in many other film and TV projects, and it lies just a short way south of where our mystery road crosses this road. And our mystery road was probably sited diagonally through this region to get around this rock formation and the other one in the distance. It passed just to the north and up through Saddleback Butte State Park, which is where we'll be picking it up next. We're picking the road up a little further northeast at Saddleback Butte State Park. This old road was apparently surveyed to skirt these mountains from the north and then go up through that low rise over there. Through the Saddleback Butte area, the old roadbed is faintly visible if you look for the line in the sagebrush, but otherwise very hard to visualize. Just northeast of Saddleback Butte is where the road finally reveals itself from the sagebrush. The first really walkable stretch of the old road is around the Butte Valley Sanctuary just off County Road N5. Now that we can actually walk along the road, we can check the sides for anything that would give us a clue to its origins, like old stagecoach wheels, trash, campfires, basically anything. I see something. Just an old can with bullet shot through it. Not unusual out here. You know, it's just not really that much on either side. Everything I've seen about this road, it seems like there wasn't really that much here. Trash dump. What do we got? Without any labels, you know, we can't tell if this is a recent dump or could be for this road or it could be for some of these old places out here.
Cans don't look that old.
They don't look that old, no.
Rusted.
Wait, here we go. Here's some.
80s-ish.
Here's something. All right, so this isn't that old.
Doesn't look that old to me.
From the font, I'd say this is 60s or 70s. So, doesn't tell us much about the road, except someone was dumping trash here in the 60s or 70s. Let's turn around, we got a few more places to get to before we lose our light. Just northeast of Butte Valley Sanctuary lies the next clue to the road's origins, and it's weird. The road enters the southwest corner of a remote desert subdivision and emerges again on the northeast side. Now, even though the road had already faded into the landscape in some areas by the 1950s, the earliest aerial photographs still show faint traces along its entire path, except here. There's no sign that the road ever crossed this subdivision, and this is the only place along its entire route where there's a significant break in its diagonal path. The road enters and leaves the rectangle at slightly different headings which don't exactly line up with one another, and the road is itself aligned to the corners of the box. This subdivision and the road show up at exactly the same time on the 1943 topo map. So all this clearly indicates that the subdivision and the road were surveyed at the same time as part of the same project. But why? The subdivision only has a few buildings to this day, and it had even fewer 70 years ago. The 1953 aerial photograph does show a building and an area of cleared land adjacent to where the road hits the southwest corner of the subdivision. Is that significant to the history of the road? If this was related to the phone company, was it some sort of a substation? That building is gone by 1974, and interestingly, remember we said that the 1957 maps shows this as a telephone utility road? Well, that's only up to the southwest corner of the box. When it starts up again on the other side, it's shown as a regular road. So, what was this subdivision, and why was it necessary to seemingly build a 60-mile road to and from it? There's a pretty good chance that if we knew who created this subdivision and why, we'd have a significant clue as to the purpose of the mystery road. Now, one would assume that if such a long road through the desert had seen extensive use, more places would have sprung up alongside it. But other than this spot and one or two scattered houses, there is only one actual named location that lies along the course of the mystery road. Next, we'll head much further northeast to explore its ruins and see what other clues await us. Now, one suggestive thing about this old road is that there aren't really any traces of houses or old settlements or anything like that. With one exception, way out in the middle of the desert, there is a designated place called Houze Place, H-O-U-Z-E place. And the only thing that marks it now is this cinder block building. And there are traces of old wells and myriad other things, but judging by a waste dump that's about a mile north of here, this building was occupied probably in the late 60s up until the mid-70s. It clearly doesn't date from the stagecoach days or even the 40s when this road is first verified to exist on maps. And indeed, there's a whole nother mystery of who built Houze Place out in the desert. This imposing cinder block structure, which had a huge fireplace and an imposing view of the desert. And a bigger question, why did they build this place in the shadow of an old and forgotten road? Well, the answer might lie a little bit further to the east. Whatever the reasons for building this homestead out in the desert, they seem to have been connected with the existence of a prior building a little bit further to the northeast and a little bit closer to the road. Unfortunately, the only photographic evidence we have of this building is from old aerial photos, but they do reveal that it existed here prior to the other building. We can see this place had a concrete foundation, wooden fixtures and roof, but most intriguingly, adobe walls. Adobe was a preferred construction material for stage stations on other stagecoach roads in the area. Situated as it is, almost exactly halfway between Barstow and Palmdale, are these the ruins of a stage station on a forgotten stagecoach road. What sat in this pit that lay directly in front of the old adobe structure? There are some large empty gasoline containers that might fit in the excavation. That raises even more questions. If this was a gas station, then why are there no evidences of it on maps in the early automobile era? It's clear from the extensive wooden ruins that surround this site that at one time Houze Place not only had an adobe building but several outbuildings. It was a hub of activity, the only place on this lonely road where anything was happening. So was it an old stage station or just the ruins of a homestead upon which later settlers built their dream desert home? With the discovery of adobe ruins, a preferred building material for stage stations but not substations, at the exact halfway point in the road, let's now return to the stagecoach road theory and take a closer look. The road not being on any topographical maps prior to 1943 seems to contradict this possibility, but it's not quite conclusive. I know from past research that, for some reason, USGS maps from the late 20s and 1930s often show less detail than maps made before or after. Though the eastern section of the road is an obvious drivable path now, it appears to have been less maintained in the 50s and perhaps before. And it may be no coincidence that the old road starts showing up on maps at the same time the Geological Survey starts using aerial photographs, as the arrow-straight old roadbed is much more obvious from the sky than from the ground. Prior maps were only made from ground surveys. It's possible that without photos from the air, and if the road had fallen into disuse by the 30s with parts revived later, the surveyors simply missed it. But could they have missed it for the entire 50 plus miles? If the road predated these maps, you would expect some trace of it to be reflected somewhere. So I went back through the maps with a fine-toothed comb, and I did find spots that were close. In the Houze Place area, the 1930s maps also showed two benchmarks set seemingly in the middle of nowhere that actually lie along the path of the mystery road. In fact, the Houze Place area was so little known that the initial 1930 survey of the area was entirely blank on the San Bernardino County portion of the map, which was most of it. In 1937, that part did get surveyed, but in the area where the road now lies, it showed basically nothing. Interestingly, the name of the incomplete 1930 quadrangle map, which showed the Houze Place area as vast unsurveyed emptiness, is Adobe, probably after Adobe Mountain, which is situated just south of the adobe ruins of Houze Place. So were they named after the adobe building at Houze? If so, it was already there by 1930, even if it was not shown on maps until the 1950s. The most intriguing clue came on a deep web search I did in 2012. Where I found a birth record for the turn of the last century for Houze Place, California. I wish I could show it to you along with the precise date, but despite extensive searching in 2023, whatever obscure corner of the web I found this on has now vanished. But this is the only hint I was able to find that Houze Place existed in name or as a settled location prior to the 1950s. Now, admittedly, this is all pretty slim evidence for the Stagecoach Road theory, but it is something. So, is it possible that a road could have been put through this area around the turn of the 20th century or even before that and then become so thoroughly forgotten it is omitted from maps of the area by the 1930s? Well, apparently yes. To see what I mean, let's go a little further west now to the 1915 USGS maps for the Antelope Valley, which show Palmdale and Lancaster. You can see that it clearly shows disconnected sections of what must have been two lengthy routes leading through Palmdale and Lancaster to the then important stage station at Willow Springs. A spur from one of these roads can also be seen leaving the map at a point close to, and at one point directly in line with, the point where the Mystery Road jogs west towards Palmdale. Now, the oldest map I've been able to find of the region is a 1907 survey of the San Andreas Fault, which shows the route through Palmdale to Willow Springs and the other route going as far as Lancaster. So these must have been early stage routes that had already fallen out of use and begun to disintegrate by 1915. And interestingly, they both run off the eastern side of the map in the general direction and proximity to our Mystery Road. The Antelope Valley had undergone a boom in the 1880s with the construction of the railroad, but thereafter was hit by a drought, which forced a lot of the early settlers out of the area. This could explain the construction and subsequent abandonment of these forgotten routes. So, whether that has anything to do with our Mystery Road or not, there can be no doubt that there were long-haul roads leading to established stage routes from the vicinity of our Mystery Road that had begun to vanish 100 years ago that are now lost to time and to memory. Once they dropped off the east end of the map, where did these ancient roads lead? Did they link up with our Mystery Road? To find more answers, I headed to the one place where there might still be some trace of these forgotten stage routes, the Pioneer Stagecoach Hub at Willow Springs. These days, the tiny Antelope Valley hamlet of Willow Springs is best known for its nearby racetrack. But back at the turn of the last century and before, it was a major stage stop on the route between Los Angeles and the gold mines of Cerro Gordo and Central California. Oh, and what would Adam Walks Around be without a bunch of dogs barking at me? Till recently, adobe ruins of the old stage station here still stood at the edge of town. Old maps do show traces of a stage route that went from Palmdale to here, and if you connect it with a wide arc going on the other side of Palmdale, not shown on those old maps, you'd have a path not dissimilar to the one we've been following. If I look at old maps and correlate it to modern day aerial photographs, there's almost no trace of this Palmdale to Willow Springs stagecoach path left, but there is what seems to be a tiny stub where it met up with the main stage line at the south end of town. And as our last bit of detective work, we're going to see if we can find it. So somewhere around here was the junction between the main stagecoach road and what seems to have been the old stagecoach road to Palmdale. Yeah, this might be the spot actually, because we got this road going over here and we got a trace of an old road going here. I'll get out, take a little closer look and see if this is vintage or not. Find a place to park.
Cool.
We're not gonna get stuck.
Thank you.
Here looks good. Think over to the side. Or no, maybe over here. Let's see. Lots of old crap. Oh yeah, we can. That's good right here. Should be able to back on out of here. We don't have a lot of time to find this ancient junction, but I'll give it a shot. If nothing else, we'll see some great desert scenery before I have to leave this country once again for Southeast Asia. There's tons of ancient trash scattered around this site. Most of this looks newer than the vintage we're looking for, but there's so much crap here, it's hard to say. I can't confirm or deny that this is the old stagecoach route. All I can say is it's in about the right place. That's my best guess based on information available. Anyway, it was around here somewhere. So, is this the final destination of our mystery road? Well, having kicked the tires on it, let me throw some cold water on the stagecoach road theory. I was able to find one map, a survey of the Los Angeles Aqueduct from 1908, that does show the routes of the roads that at that time went from Willow Springs through Palmdale and Lancaster and then dropped off the east sides of the maps. And what it says is that they continued on an eastbound path for many miles until they basically dead-ended in the middle of the desert. So, not the southwest to northeast track of our mystery road. But since this was an extensive map of the aqueduct and not the surrounding desert, and we already know that that area had not been surveyed, for all we know this could be vague guesswork by the map makers. Would anyone really bother to push these roads that far into the desert without them leading anywhere? Unless they were going to some mines or something like that, it seems unlikely, and since this was a map of the aqueduct and not the desert, it's hard to know if it portrayed the peripheral roads accurately or not. For what it's worth, a completely different map made in 1936 by a local resident showing the paths of what he called pioneer roads does show a track following the path of our mystery road, but only for one section of it. It's also worth mentioning that the adobe ruins at Houze Place have what appear to be concrete foundations. Though such foundations were in use from the beginning of the 20th century, that type of construction became more widespread in the late 1940s. And that brings me to the third theory of the road's origin, which I imagine some history buffs watching this show have been screaming at the screen since close to the beginning of the video. If we go solely by the maps and aerial photos, the road wasn't there in 1937, was built by 1943, and was already seemingly abandoned by 1948. Was there any event on the timeline that could explain this fact set? Yeah, there sure was. The US entry into World War II. Now, the Mojave Desert was a hotbed of military activity as the United States quickly geared up for the global conflict. And if we trace the path of the road to the last points where we can be relatively sure it went, we get two very suggestive locations. On the northeast, the desert town of Hinckley, which lies alongside a railroad that ran between several military bases in the region. And on the southwestern side, the road seems to lead to the southeastern corner of what was then the Air Force landing strip at Palmdale. The United States military certainly would have had the resources to quickly build such a road across the desert, and it's easy to imagine why, in 1942, as the country went on a wartime footing, there might have been a need for a more direct connection between the military bases around Barstow and the facilities and roads near Palmdale. If so, we can only speculate at what the exact use of the road might have been, but it's notable that when the Mystery Road intersected with State Highway 58, then US 466, it changed paths to hit the highway at a right angle. This both suggests that the Mystery Road was constructed after US 466 was already there, and that there was some consideration that vehicles and materials would need to cross that highway. If it was constructed as a telephone road or as a stagecoach road, there would be no need to adjust the alignment to cross US 466. This would also explain why the road fell so rapidly into disuse and was already disappearing or being plowed over as early as 1948. The war was over. The road would have probably seen almost no use by civilians and perhaps not even by the military, so before it could get adopted for overland travel, the road had probably already deteriorated enough so that it wasn't feasible. Indeed, there's some indications on the old aerial photographs that some parts of the western section had been wiped out by flooding, and with the road not under regular maintenance, one flash flood would be enough to prevent the road's use as a through route between the two cities. This explanation, while it does seem to fit the facts the best, does leave a lot of questions still unanswered, and I think it's possible each of these three theories might have some weight. It is just possible that there was a stagecoach or pioneer route through the area that had faded out before the maps were surveyed, and it's also possible that the military might have used parts of such a route as a fast way to push their road through in a wartime emergency. It's also possible that after the war, the phone company bought up the right-of-way for above or below ground lines to service post-war settlements in the high desert. Or there could be a completely different explanation. But for now, this is where the trail ends. And that's about as much as I can give you for what I think is the explanation for this mysterious old road in the desert. But if you know more, or perhaps you are a historian for the area, I encourage you to comment and give us the full history of this mystery road.